Well, hello and welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining this session of the European Health Forum Gastein. This is entitled Global Pandemic Preparedness Post-2021, Anticipating Tomorrow's Threats with Today's Learnings, very much in keeping, of course, with the theme of the whole conference, which is Rise Like a Phoenix, Health at the Heart of a Resilient Future for Europe. So then it's all about rethinking what we can learn out of the COVID crisis. The new opportunities will arise and we can learn from each other to look ahead to future shared opportunities to tackle any threats that come up. So we're going to look and focus on lessons learned from the current pandemic, as well as looking back at earlier infectious diseases and taking into account other things like technologies, synthetic biology, and the impact of climate change on emerging diseases and the constantly changing landscape of threats that come from man-made or natural disasters. We're going to be looking at measures and initiatives aimed at tackling future threats across Europe and indeed across the world, and thinking about how the international community can come together to pool that knowledge and face anything that comes up with fresh solutions. Well, my name is Sue Saville. I was the medical correspondent at Britain's ITV News for many years, and I was very honoured to join EHFG in beautiful Bad Hofgastein 2 years ago, I think it was, which was amazing. And let's hope that the sessions will get back there one day. I thought I'd wear my Austrian jacket just to sort of feel in the mood, in the spirit for beautiful Gastein. We have 4 top-level speakers with us today who are going to discuss each of their areas of expertise with me, and then they'll come together on a panel to take your questions. So please submit your questions via the Zoom webinar Q&A box. You can send those in as they occur to you throughout the session, and we'll take as many of your questions as we can when we come to the panel session towards the end. And you can tweet your thoughts. You can use the hashtag EHFG2021. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce the speakers. We have Velina Pendalovska, who is the Deputy Head of the Health Security Unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for Health and Food Safety. Also, we have Dr. Sui Keng Kaur, who is an Associate Fellow at Chatham House and a Senior Visiting Fellow at the United Nations University's International Institute of Global Health in Malaysia. Also, Raina McIntyre, who's joining us from Australia. She's the Head of Biosecurity Research Programme at the Kirby Institute at the University of South Wales in Sydney. And she has a specialist interest in re-emerging and emerging pathogens and the impact of climate change. Also, we have Phil Gomez. He's the CEO of SIGA Technologies. That's an American pharmaceutical company focused on the health security market, looking at medical countermeasures against all sorts of different threats, including emerging infectious diseases. So welcome to all the speakers. But before we dive into our discussions with those speakers, we'd like to have a word with you, the audience, first. What do you foresee as the threats to global health security? We'd like just to engage you now. If you'd have a look at the Slido poll, you've probably used these before, very simple. You'll see that QR code that's popped up on the screen. You can either hold your phone to the QR code to activate it onto your phone, or you can simply click the link which the EHFG team will have posted in the public chat there. So, asking this question, how do you think the current pandemic situation will impact long-term global preparedness? Is it going to worsen the existing situation? Oh, I can see there's a lot of responses already there. No, the gaps are going to remain the same. Or global health will become stronger and more balanced. Give you just a few moments to get that app going. Do vote on Slido. It would be great to see what your thoughts are at this point. So, what do we think, team? This is interesting. Global health will become stronger. Will it worsen, or will it become more balanced? Should we take it there? Let's close the poll at this point and have a look at that. So, interesting result then, that 40% saying the pandemic will worsen. Oh no, let's see, it's closing now. Actually, that's interesting. Then it's come out. Oh, it's still moving along. global health will become stronger and more balanced. 35% say yes. Pandemic will worsen the situation. Exactly the same number saying that's the case. And the gaps will remain. Actually, a significant number saying that. So that's quite interesting. And it'll be interesting to see what the speakers make of that as we speak to them. Perhaps very quickly, let's just very quickly go around the speakers, bring you in before I do our one-on-ones. What do you make of that result, Velina?
Thank you, Sue. Excellent question, I think. Well, what can I say? I think that COVID-19 has been a wake-up call to some. I mean, in the health community, we obviously know that preparedness is vital. It's important. As we like to say, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. But I think that, you know, health ministers, let's say, would also have the task to convince finance ministers to finance preparedness, because that comes with a cost. And that clearly is not always easy. It's not easy, let's say, in the EU, but it may be even harder in other parts of the world.
Thank you.
So,
if I just take it there, I just wanted a very quick run around the panel before we go into our one-on-ones, but that's really helpful. Rainer, what do you make of that result? Does it surprise you?
No, I think there's a bit of truth in both of the most popular options, that in some respects, global health will become stronger. I mean, just the fact that the world was able to produce vaccines so rapidly in less than 12 months, that's a strength. But it's also true that the existing inequalities will be exacerbated through, you know, lack of access, lack of resources, etc. So,
thank you, Swee Keng. What do you make of the result? Was that what you expected?
Yes and no. Yes, because these results are what I expected, because global health as a concept is very large and it's possible to contain multitudes at the same time of statements that are correct even simultaneously and at the same time. So no, I'm not really surprised. Maybe I'll make another initial comment by saying that there is a view that global health preparedness will need to be medicalized, and that's hopefully a view that we can explore as we go through the panel. Thanks, Sue, over to you.
Thank you. And Phil, what do you make of that result?
Yeah, I think it makes sense given where we are in the pandemic, and I do think there's an amazing history here of increasing our preparedness. I know it doesn't seem that way in the middle of a pandemic, but I think this reflects we're on a journey, and I think I'm hopeful that we're going to continue that journey, and maybe we'll get that improvement number up in another 5-10 years. But anyway, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. So let's just dive a bit deeper with each of our speakers. Velina Pendalovska then, from the European Commission's Directorate General for Health and Food Safety. Interesting for you, you've moved then across to DG Santé. You have experience in climate action from your previous role. So as the link then that we're seeing between climate change and health security is likely to intensify, how do you think that's going to impact the work then of the Health Security Committee?
Thank you. Absolutely. Climate change is one of the big, how can I say, biggest crisis that we're facing. And chances are it will only exacerbate some of the diseases that we have to face, the infectious diseases. And we start to see this. But in terms of what are the main issues that we may tackle in the future, and specifically in the EU, we have this Health Security Committee that you mentioned. This is the group of our EU member states together with the Commission, where we discuss preparedness and response activities. We are now embarking on complete revision of our legislation in the EU when it comes to health security. We have one legal act, which is about preparedness and response. And so I'd like to agree with Phil, what he just said, that we have had preparedness, we have had certain architecture, but certainly, as I said, COVID-19 has been a wake-up call, and we have drawn lessons from that, and we're trying to strengthen this even more. And the key word for us in the EU is coordination. And it has proven absolutely vital over the past months to ensure that no country can face this alone, and that we need to coordinate between each other. And this is what we're trying to strengthen in this new legislation. But if you allow me, Sue, another threat just to mention, another threat besides climate change, besides re-emerging diseases and so on, which is already looming on the horizon. I absolutely would like to point that out. That's antimicrobial resistance. It's termed the silent tsunami, and we know it. And again, in our health circles, we know it very well. We keep saying it's an urgent threat, but I do believe that more and more people need to know it. We need to raise awareness. And COVID-19, if you allow me to say, has now created this momentum where it has shown how one virus, can upend our lives so dramatically. So let alone all bacteria out there. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
And that's really interesting. You talk then about collaboration, about working together. And of course, across the EU, we've seen the joint procurement when it came to vaccines. And you raised that spectre of AMR, which has been with us for some time now and still hasn't been really tackled or addressed. So in tackling AMR and tackling anything else that's coming up, how about public-private partnerships? Do they have a role in this?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned vaccines. I think that it was the big achievement, but that we would like to consider that a big achievement, not only for the EU, but also globally. What was mentioned by Raina, the advent of new vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines in such a short period of time, thanks to a very substantive investment in that research and development work. You mentioned joint procurement, a couple of words on joint procurement, because obviously vaccines has been the big thing, but we also have had this process at EU level of procuring jointly not only vaccines, but all sorts of medical supplies. We started with masks at the time when those were in deficit, and gloves and so on and so forth. So at this point in time, I have here the exact figures. We have 12 joint procurement procedures with over 200 contracts for the supply of various essential medical supplies and now therapeutics to the overall value of 13 billion euro. This is, yes, I think this is important to mention. And the latest joint procurements that we've had are now on therapeutics, because that's also the other side of the coin, if you would allow me. Vaccines is one, prevention, but we also need to cure that disease. And we have had now 3 contracts in place for therapeutics of around 900 million euro. Thank you.
And in setting that up then, Velina, new structures, new means of moving forward, but lessons perhaps being learned internationally. With the HERA set up in the EU, the Health Emergency and Preparedness Response Authority, how is that being modelled perhaps on the American version known as BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority? Is the BARDA, the US model, the way that the European model needs to go? Are there things that you would change? Are there lessons that are valuable there?
Yes, well, certainly it's part of our lessons learned, and this was the proposal that we made last November, what I mentioned on strengthening our health security architecture. We realized that one of the missing things that we would like to have also in the EU is this sort of BARDA equivalent, which we didn't have, and that is HERA, the Health Emergency Preparedness Response Authority that you mentioned. It was now officially launched on the 16th of September, and it will be fully operational as from, we hope, as from the beginning of next year. It takes a bit of time, but we're trying to set it up as rapidly as possible. So the idea there was to leverage all of the possibilities that we have at EU level to support preparedness even further by, for example, strategic stockpiling, by ensuring that we have, how can I say, guaranteed security of supply of certain critical medical countermeasures. As we saw at the beginning of this pandemic, that was a problem. And so HERA will work towards that, and it will work with its international, of course, counterparts. That is part of its mission to also contribute to the global health security by working with BARDA and what have you all over the world.
And of course, during the pandemic, no one country has got it absolutely right. There've been difficulties along the way. Team Europe has been very outspoken about the EU's contribution to COVID-19 response, and several tools have been used to support other countries, including the all sorts of tools like rescue and the EIB funds and direct contributions to COVAX. So what's the position now? Where's the EU then in the international global health arena in terms of trying to learn about those different structures?
Yes, indeed, as you rightly said, Team Europe. So that, just for those who may not know, this is essentially the EU, the Commission, plus the member states, plus our financial bodies like EIB. We pride ourselves, I would say, on the fact that we have been major contributors to the global response. And I again have here the figures in front of me. We have donated over half of our vaccines produced on our territory, 500 million doses. Then the contribution that we've made to COVAX, about 3 billion euro, and so have you. And that is, of course, likely to continue. We're not stopping. But I would like to, in this context, besides Team Europe and this sort of financial contribution and political contribution that we are making, just to stress one other element. There is currently discussion, and it will be at the end of November at the World Health Assembly of the WHO, a discussion whether to have a new pandemic treaty. And we in the EU have been supporters of this idea because we do believe that there is scope for strengthening the international law when it comes to global preparedness and global response. That entails also surveillance, that entails the capacities to respond, that entails the intersectoral collaboration goes behind it. So we, from our side, our position has been to support this initiative, and let's see what will be ultimately the decision at the end of November. But I think this is one important initiative where we would be looking forward as EU for further developments.
And that's such an important initiative, as you say. I understand that the International Pandemic Treaty was originally proposed in Europe by the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, but perhaps doesn't have the support of all the nations in the world, the US, even though it has the support of the WHO. But as you say, that would be something perhaps it'd be really nice to pick up on the panel and see what people think about where that can go, what's going to be needed to make that go ahead. But just before we move on then, Velina, I just want to ask you one more little point, perhaps briefly then, looking also at the area of your expertise then, just briefly looking ahead to any re-emerging or emerging pathogens, things that we perhaps don't know about or that might come back to haunt us. Anything that you're working on specifically?
Yes, thank you for this question. Well, absolutely. The emerging and re-emerging pathogens are something that we intend to, how can I say, invest more. And now we have in the EU much bigger instrument, financial instrument, that is our EU for Health program. I think several times bigger than what we used to have before in terms of financial envelope. And so very concretely, we're planning to launch specific actions there on boosting surveillance, essentially boosting surveillance, detecting this, working with national labs, boosting their capacities for detection and linking everything in what we call real-term integrated surveillance, because it's absolutely vital. There are vast domains of data that is out there that are not necessarily linked, labs, hospitals, what have you, and we would like to improve this, improve surveillance in the EU. So very concretely, we have two upcoming. One is a study and the other one is what we call a joint action. It's a grant working together with member state authorities to support this integrated surveillance, and with our European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, a very important player.
That's really helpful for setting the landscape there, Velina. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see that questions are already coming in. There's going to be one for you, Velina, when we come to the panel, coming to you about HERA and how it can work together with the ECDC. But I'm going to save that because we're going to move on now to speak to Sui Keng Kaur, who's the Associate Fellow at Chatham House and a Visiting Fellow at the United Nations University. So Sui Keng, you've got very broad international experience working in different areas across the world. So in a good position to comment something about the dynamics then in the global situation. What would you say have been the most important international, maybe regional bodies that have really helped and made a difference during the COVID pandemic? And why would that be?
Sue, thank you. Just a check that you can hear me okay.
Yes, all good. We're hearing you loud and clear.
Thank you. So it would be great for me to answer the question and give you a list of all the organizations, either global or international or regional, that have done well for this particular pandemic. Unfortunately, I don't have such a list, because unfortunately, this pandemic over the last 20 months or so have shown that nation states are still very important. And it's a very nation state driven response for COVID around the world. We see that in the early stages where there was a competition for face masks. We see that today where there's still a competition for vaccines. And we're seeing perhaps a retreat into the nation state and less of an emphasis on international collaboration. This is obviously unfortunate. I'll add on two more comments, Sue, by saying secondly that existing organizations are proving perhaps not up to the mark. And it's unfortunate that organizations like the United Nations framework with the Security Council and the General Assembly have been notably absent from the COVID response around the world. The WHO is not intended to become a delivery organization. The WHO is a standards setter and capacity building organization. And during the emergency period of COVID, it was very difficult for the underfunded, under-resourced, understaffed WHO to deliver the necessary tools and skill sets that countries will eventually need. So broadly speaking, there could be what we can consider to be an ineffective use of existing global mechanisms, which leads to my third point, Sue, that because of the inefficiencies or the inadequate presence of existing global institutions, Security Council all the way down to United Nations Security Council, all the way down to WHO and even WHO regional and country level officers, then the question is now coming up, do we need new institutions, new treaties, new institutions, new organizations that we should build up from scratch? A Global Health Threats Council, for example, that was proposed by the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response in May this year. And that conversation right now has got two camps. The first camp is we should strengthen existing institutions. And the second camp is we should build new institutions because old institutions are not fit for purpose. I fall in the first camp, and maybe throughout the rest of this panel, Sue, we'll be able to explore a little bit of why I fall into the first camp. Let me pause here for a few seconds. Sue, over to you.
Well, let's pick up on that. Why do you think that? Why would you not want to build new structures? Why would you rather stay with the structures that we have then?
A couple of reasons, Sue. Firstly, some negative reasons and then some positive reasons. The negative reasons for not building new structures is that it takes time, energy, political commitment, money, and a lot of political capital just to create the institution. Secondly, that institution will then need to interact with existing institutions. What do we do with the WHO, for example? Do we retire it? How do they work with each other? And thirdly, new institutions will need to staff up, and they will not have the institutional memory to, well, operate on day one, so to speak. So these are very good reasons not to build new institutions. Instead, I would like to put my money on strengthening existing institutions, perhaps in three very specific ways. The first way is global enforcement. We can have all the beautiful treaties written on beautiful pieces of paper and documents, but if you don't have enforceability, then there's no point, even if you can have beautiful global standards. And enforcement has no gold standard for it. What I mean to say is you need a combination of, shall we say, self-review, like the Universal Periodic Review process for human rights, or the voluntary national reviews for the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's self-review. You pair self-review together with peer review. For example, the World Trade Organization's trade policy review mechanism has got peer reviews, and you need to pair self-review with peer review with external reviews by groups of experts. For example, the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions, or the International Labour Organization's labor rights enforcement. So anyway, all that is to say that there's no one gold standard for enforcement. Existing institutions like the United Nations and WHO need to strengthen their enforcement. The second way they need to strengthen is to ensure that there is sustainable capacity building and resources provided to low and middle income countries. Species-wide threats like pandemics, climate change, antimicrobial resistance cannot only be a rich world problem and they keep to themselves. Therefore, sustainable capacity building and funding needs to be provided to low and middle income countries for them to build their own capacity and center themselves in the global conversation. Thirdly, and finally, existing institutions probably need to build capacity for resource allocation and duties allocation. Resource allocation is easy to understand. the world has a finite number of masks, ventilators, vaccines, and we need to appropriately distribute these resources around the world. But not just the distribution of resources, it's also the distribution of duties and responsibilities. And at that distribution of duties and responsibilities, we can learn a lot of lessons from the Paris Agreement. Imperfect as it is, it will be a good starting point for global health. Let me pause here again, Sue, over to you.
Gosh, thank you. There's so much in there about, I think you're going to have to write the blueprint for how this could be done. And it's really interesting to hear how you'd like to build then on those existing organizations or learn from things like World Trade and bring those in. Well, what about civil society? What role do you see could be enhanced there to develop partnerships with civil society? Because we've certainly learned during the pandemic that everybody has to be involved and have a voice. What role do you see for civil society in this?
So I think that's a great role for civil societies, but permit me to take one step backward before I answer the question about civil societies. I just thought of something that we can learn from the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. After that global financial crisis, the world built up new infrastructure and architecture to prevent a second global financial crisis. So the Bank of International Settlements, Financial Stability Board was empowered, and we created minimum tier 1 capital ratios for all sorts of global systemically important banks. And that's a huge set of lessons that global health can learn from as well, how to restructure and re-engineer the global health architecture following from the lessons from the global financial crisis in 08 and 09. So let me move away from that and talk about the social sectors. I believe strongly that the think tanks, civil societies, non-governmental organizations, and non-governmental individuals have a great role to play. Not only is it a sectoral, inclusive approach, right, that we get academics and think tankers involved, and I belong to several think tanks myself. This is the latest iteration of my career, and we would love to get a seat on the table to help enrich the intellectual capital. We're less practitioners, perhaps, but I think that the scholars will be able to add some capital as well. But let me expand a little bit more, Sue, to also not talk about think tanks and non-governmental organizations and civil societies, but to talk about inclusiveness as a general principle. The Bretton Woods model, where we have decisions made for the world by Washington, Brussels, Paris, or Geneva, should be really it's a Cold War approach and it should be left in the Cold War era. But in today's inclusive era, we need representation, not just in diverse sectors, but also from diverse geographies, from diverse genders, diverse ages, and also diverse, shall we say, intellectual disciplines. And when you have a truly inclusive, say, set of solutions that are on the table, people own the solutions, and then global health will be stronger as a result. Again, Sue, let me pause here and over to you.
Thank you very much. And there's so many interesting points in there that perhaps we could pick up on the panel discussion. But for now, you've given us so many fantastic thoughts to think about. I'm going to say thank you for that. And I'm going to move on now. And we'll speak with Rainer McIntyre, Head of Biosecurity at the Research Programme at Kirby Institute in the University of South Wales in Sydney. Rainer, gosh, you've been closely involved then with the response in Australia and across the region. What do you think are the main lessons about that response across different areas, indeed different cultures?
Well, I think we saw early in the pandemic some large differences emerging. For example, well, most strikingly, we saw high-income countries with lots of resources not controlling the pandemic, and the US was the most extreme example early in the pandemic, but also some European countries. And we also, recall the Global Health Security Index, which was launched in 2019, and that predicted the US would be number one in pandemic response, and also ranked several European countries very highly. But we saw that countries that had been ranked low on the Global Health Security Index actually did quite well, such as Vietnam, Thailand too, Samoa and other Pacific islands, Australia, New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand were ranked highly. So what is it that made those differences? And I think the Global Health Security Index is actually a good index. It's got all the disease and country-specific and health system parameters in there, but probably there were 3 other parameters that it did not include, which might have explained some of those differences. And one is culture. So public health measures for pandemic control are draconian by nature. You know, you have to stop having contact with other people. You have to wear masks. You're not allowed to go to places you want to go to. So those kind of public health measures are less palatable in highly individualistic countries. Secondly, the impact of leadership. So even in a highly individualistic country, good leadership can bring people along on the journey and help to implement those public health measures. But where we had the combination of bad leadership and highly individualistic culture, it was kind of a, you know, a double whammy of factors that led to poor pandemic control.
And that's really sorry, you got a third point there.
The third is universal healthcare. You know, in the US, for example, not everyone could access healthcare, and some people, you know, in many states, you had to pay quite a lot of money to get tested for COVID. So, and that's really not going to work for pandemic control. All those things have to be provided free of charge. So those might have been some of the factors.
And interesting then, as you say, that the index, the Global Health Security Index, got it so wrong in so many cases. What then was it of the countries that you indicate there, like Vietnam and so on, countries across the Asia-Pacific region that did better than that index indicated? What was it that they were responding to? How did they use science or available evidence in order to get into that better position?
Well, I think they just used traditional public health measures. You know, you have to test, you have to trace, you have to use movement restriction where necessary. And that, you know, it didn't happen in the US. The US did not get across testing for a really, really long time. And, you know, I'm not even sure they're still across testing, but testing was a major problem. And that's, you know, it had already spread everywhere by the time, you know, there were reasons why it panned out like that, but that was quite shocking to see the most technologically advanced country in the world unable to get across testing, to get the testing sorted out. You know, in Australia, we had it sorted out very early. You could get a test result in 24 hours, and it's still the case, even though we're having an epidemic at the moment.
And what about the experience that you've had then, Rainer? I understand you were involved a couple of years ago in this Pacific eclipse, a great big simulation of an exercise of something that might happen, looking at whether smallpox might re-emerge and trying to think how to tackle that. What learnings came from that?
Well, actually, many of the learnings for that were applicable to COVID. You know, smallpox has a similar incubation period to the ancestral strain anyway of SARS-CoV-2, and a similar R0 to the Wuhan strain and the D614G strain. So we modeled an epidemic and then a pandemic of smallpox that occurred starting in the Pacific in Fiji, and then spreading to India. And what we looked at was things like vaccine nationalism, where the countries that were meant to pledge their vaccine doses to the WHO stockpile held onto them instead out of national interest. So we brought up this issue of national interest versus global interest. And of course, that just blew out the pandemic much more than it needed to have blown out. But we also looked at, you know, it was sort of in three phases: the acute phase of trying to work out what it is, the intermediate phase where it's spreading everywhere, and then the recovery and the recovery phase. And we looked at a lot of things that actually did occur, like stranded cruise ships that weren't allowed to dock anywhere, travel bans, closing of international borders. And we looked at the critical infrastructure impacts and the non-health side of pandemic response. You know, police unable to get PPE, military involved in the response, all of these things, because in the end, the health part of it is only one part of pandemic response, and yet most pandemic planning is very health-centric. So we really wanted to bring that multidisciplinary perspective into it.
And you were so right. So many of the things you've just outlined exactly did happen. We obviously saw nationalism, we saw self-interest, we saw hoarding of and stockpiling of whether that was PPE or vaccines or whatever. So you'd anticipated and worked through some of those, and yet it still happened. And what about then at the point that Swee Keng made there about the diversity that's going to be needed to respond to this, so that all countries, wherever they come from, whatever national setups they have, can actually respond and join together? How important will diversity be in our future responses?
It's really important, even in localized epidemics in a city, you have to have community-driven response where, you have people in the communities that are affected, often communities with lower socioeconomic status and structural disadvantage. It's got to be people in those communities driving the response and engaging with other people in the community, kind of snowballing, train the trainer type scenarios. You can't do it in a top-down way when you've got, when the relationship with disadvantage in the epidemic is so clear.
And just touching again on some more of your expertise, that I understand that you've been able to look at why certain regions or nations seem to have a particularly high incidence of COVID, and you looked at Italy and you looked at the measles aspect of that. What have you learned from that, or how might that be relevant?
Well, measles causes an immune paresis, kind of a general immune paresis, and it's been well studied. So after you have measles, for maybe even up to 3 years, you're more prone to other infections, any other infection, because of this immune paresis induced by measles. So 2019 actually saw some of the worst measles outbreaks, epidemics in the world. In Europe, places like the Ukraine, but also Italy and other countries in Europe, countries in the Pacific. So Samoa had declared a state of national emergency because of a large measles outbreak. And that's probably why they shut their borders when COVID came and kept the country relatively COVID-free. But I always wondered whether the severity of that first wave in Italy was related to the previous epidemic of measles that they'd had.
And that brings into play the whole idea of the holistic approach then to preparedness, that we have to, across the health spectrum, be ready. And if your findings are accurate there, that perhaps vulnerability through other conditions is something to consider, keeping the whole population healthy. Rainer, thank you very much for those initial contributions and those initial thoughts. I know there are going to be lots of points to pick up on when we come to the panel discussion. Audience, please do keep sending in your questions. It's lovely to see that they're coming in already. You're going to have the chance to talk to some of these really, really top experts and find out a bit more. And we'll move on now to speak to Phil Gomez. He is the CEO of SIGA, this American pharmaceutical company looking at all sorts of different threats, including emerging infectious diseases. Now, Phil, you've worked alongside the BARDA organization that we'd mentioned before in US. How did that work? Was it successful? Was the partnership useful for you in terms of getting ahead and learning what are the best steps to take?
Sue, so absolutely. I think our story with BARDA is one of, I think, again, one of those examples of hope and a model for how to evolve. I think it's important, though, to remember, as I said up front, there's a history to this field. And I'd like to build on Swee Keng's comment about improving, but not necessarily throwing out what happened before. So one of the authors of the legislation for BARDA, who's a mentor of mine, described the US health security response as imperfect incrementalism. We would kind of look at what happened and we'd add a little bit onto it, and we were never right, and we're not right yet, but at least it evolved. So in my career, I've had the pleasure of working on a lot of public-private partnerships. I was part of a team at a biotech company that developed a meningitis C vaccine in the UK in the 90s, where they had a large outbreak. They partnered with industry and they accelerated the development and launch of those vaccines in the UK. I was an investigator at the US National Institutes of Health, which created a place called the Vaccine Research Center to accelerate vaccine development in 2001. And we were focused on HIV, but we actually developed the first SARS vaccine, the first West Nile vaccine. Subsequently, they developed the first Zika vaccine. And the tools we developed back in 2001, 2, 3, where we translated the first SARS vaccine, I think in 24 months from discovery of virus to the clinic, which seems quaint now that we've developed a COVID vaccine in a year, but the tools and the things that happened there were very important for overall pandemic response, as are many innovations around the globe that people have focused on. But BARDA in particular illustrates, I think, an important gap that was filled with that organization. So for SIGA, we had a small molecule drug, a treatment for orthopox infection. The research was funded by the National Institutes of Health and other US government agencies, but there was no market for it. No one was being infected day by day with smallpox, so there was really no incentive to develop it or be able to translate that into a market. So with the creation of BARDA, BARDA does two things that I think are critically important. One, it funds research post phase 1 clinical testing. So we call it kind of advanced development. And that is complex, and we could talk about that, Sue, why it's so hard to do these product development, but they fund that. More importantly, they provide a market. So as a CEO of a company, if I looked at, should I work on disease X or Y, I look at the patient population, what's the unmet medical need. When you're talking about smallpox, there's no unmet medical need unless there's an outbreak. So the public sector, the government stepping in and saying, yes, there's a market was critical for SIGA to be able to do that R&D and ultimately sell its product at a very highly negotiated public focused price into the strategic national stockpile. So BARDA was a great partner in that development, but also our customer at the end of the day to be able to deliver it to the stockpile.
And you touch on stockpiles there. Of course, preparing for any future pandemic is not a one-time spend. Stockpiles will run out, their maturity will come to an end. So in thinking ahead in that, and as you say, with the funding that comes in from a government organization, how best can that be addressed? How can that planning to invest in the stockpiles, keep renewing them, be done? Is it a public-private partnership between an organization like yours and a government, or where are the challenges in setting that up?
Yes, and I would say that's an evolving policy in the U.S. because I think, as I said, BARDA focused on research first. Then they realized, well, if you make it, you have to actually put it in a stockpile. Then our legislators said, oh my gosh, these things expire. We have to buy them again. That seems inefficient, but of course you do. Drugs and vaccines don't last forever. And so a lot of the language has been thinking of it more as an insurance policy than a buying of a drug or a vaccine. This really is an ongoing preparedness effort to balance how much can we surge if there's an outbreak versus how much do we need in a warehouse immediately, or else we won't be able to prevent the outbreak. Professor McIntyre has done some very important work with these tabletop exercises and modeling because we don't know what will happen with some of these diseases. And so unless you do those exercises, it's hard to know what the balance is of how much should be in a warehouse and a stockpile and how much could be responded later.
And what about for a company like yours then in the private sector? What's the role in terms of innovation or sharing technology or trying to widely distribute the learnings that you have? How can you innovate and help move things forward?
So I think the role of private sector in most of health security is we typically are out there working on technologies and have infrastructure to develop products that can actually be approved by regulatory agencies and distributed. So we have a toolbox. And what's important, I think, on the public sector side is to help prioritize what is needed, what needs to be developed, and then find partnerships with companies that have the technology to develop it. But I also think the bigger challenge there is often, what is the market going to be? When I was at NIH, we developed the first Ebola vaccine. At that time, Ebola hadn't had a lot of outbreaks, and so it was thought of more as a biological weapon or something that could be released in a nefarious way. But it turns out, of course, that's actually a very logical, natural public health threat that could emerge as it did in the last outbreak. So on the public sector side, focusing on what's most important is critical. And I think that's where modeling and prioritization that we see the WHO doing in organizations like CEPI is critical. So industry knows when and how and where to engage.
Thank you. And there's some great questions coming in, which we will take when we get to the panel. Just a comment to pick up there from John Bowers coming in saying good lessons should not be ignored. Interrelationship between diseases, community engagement, innovation, and the cost of slow coordination. How to improve this multi-sectoral coordination. So as you're saying there, Phil, it's a role that's got to go across the private sector and the public sector. And you touched on the experience of Ebola. What about the experience of SARS that you've had? How has that helped?
So yeah, I think, so I was part of a team back in 2001 at the NIH that developed the first SARS vaccine. And really we developed it and the disease went away and there was no BARDA at that point. So we had a company who had a very viable SARS vaccine and they never advanced it. In retrospect, I think we should have thought of SARS as a coronavirus that could have other coronaviruses evolving. And had we looked in retrospect, perhaps developing a SARS vaccine would have helped us with some cross protection against other coronaviruses. The example I'll also give is with our drug. Our drug was developed for smallpox, but it turns out it's an orthopox drug. We've applied in the EU for approval for not only smallpox, but monkeypox. And we see monkeypox increasing in Central Africa because we stopped immunizing against smallpox. We have a collaboration with Oxford University to provide our drug on a compassionate use basis in the CAR, Central African Republic, and we've provided it for patients that have shown up in London and other places. So I think the strategy that's been articulated by the G20 around looking at families of viruses, developing vaccines and drugs for a prototypic virus in that family is spot on, because we've actually done that in the world of pox viruses with the vaccines and therapeutics that have been developed.
Lovely. And while we're with you, we'll pick up one of the questions coming in. It's so relevant to what you're saying, asking how we can incentivize private vaccine production based on public health needs, bypassing the short-term political thinking. How does that work?
Yeah, and I think there's a variety of tools in that toolbox. There are certainly push incentives like promoting research and development, promoting infrastructure, reserving unused capacity to help a company maintain excess capacity, because the economic incentive is to always be 100% utilized. And then there is that stockpiling and procurement option at the back end, the pull incentives that pull it through. And it is a balance, and it's a journey we're going to have to continue to work on to decide what the right balances of those are. But I would point out the economic challenges are as difficult as the technical challenges. There are no simple answers as to how to incentivize.
That's a pity. Phil, thank you for that. For meanwhile, we'll come to the panel shortly. But having heard from all our four speakers, I'd like to turn now again to the audience. And do keep posting those questions, which we'll pick up when we come to our panel. But just for now, back to Slido. We want to ask you again to scan the QR code, which will pop up, and there it is, using your phone, or you can look at the link posted in the public chat. And this time, I want you to choose a word or a phrase very briefly to populate a word cloud, asking what, in your opinion, is the biggest challenge for global preparedness and response to emerging health threats at the moment. So be creative, come up with some words. What do you think are those biggest challenges? You might be thinking about things like, oh, that's great, interesting things coming in already. Lack of communication, lack of transparency, nationalism, lack of solidarity. And with these word clouds, when more people suggest a word, the word gets bigger on the screen. So nationalism already standing out. And of course, the factors that could be the challenges could be right across all sorts of areas, whether that's financial or physical. Is it in some way collaborative, regionalistic, psychological, even in terms of our preparedness? Are we really ready to think about the future? So there's some fantastic ideas coming in. Political will, we sort of touched on that. No sense of urgency, not predictable, individualism. Some great ideas coming in on that poll. So it's lovely to see how you're responding to that. Great, well, we've had some fantastic answers there. Let's draw that poll to a close and just have a little look at that. So nationalism is certainly the one that stands out there. But other things like lack of data infrastructure, that's a strong one, and the lack of solidarity and the political will, short-term planning cycles. We've certainly seen that. So let's bring our panel, all four speakers, back in now. And let's initially just ask each of you to respond to that. Velina, nationalism, is that what you think is the biggest challenge?
Well, I mean, even within the EU, we saw that, I wouldn't call it exactly nationalism, but there was this initial instinct of countries to pull and to think about their own citizens first, which of course led to issues like, well, truck drivers at borders suddenly being stuck and things like that, and the flow of essential goods, essential in terms of medical supplies even. And so it quickly became clear that that's not how it's going to work, and it's not going to be the winning formula here. So I would agree that that could be a challenge, but hopefully it would show that it's not going. Diseases don't stop at borders, and while it may have worked for some to close the borders, I think in our very globalized world, this is not a viable solution for the long term.
And Sui Kang, I'm interested in your response to that word cloud. Do you think that's fair? Nationalism stands out?
Yeah, I think it's a reasonably fair standout for nationalism. It's also true, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, Sue, that this pandemic has just rendered the emphasis to be on countries, but that's not a good or bad thing. Nationalism can be a good thing if we harness it correctly. And one way to harness it correctly is to provide the political reasons so that politicians will engender the political will for them to develop their preparedness systems, universal health coverage, healthier populations, and then to prepare their entire countries for the next pandemic, because it gives them, shall we say, political benefits because they win in the next election. So I must say I'm a little neutral on nationalism, that it doesn't have to be an unadulterated bad, that if we utilize and harness it appropriately, we can actually make it work in our favor. Over to you, Sue.
Thanks. And Rainer, what do you make of that? There's the nationalism. What about some of the other aspects that have come strongly through there?
Yeah, look, I think nationalism, in the end, governments answer to the people who elect them. And that's why, in a pandemic, you'll see national interests trumping global interests. Health literacy, I think, is an important one, and we've seen a lot of false narratives and, strange kind of twisting of facts, even by politicians in some instances. And a sort of one thing that we've seen is an anti-science agenda that's really come to the fore during this pandemic. It's been tied to both anti-vaccination, anti-masks, anti-public health measures. And I think in this era of mass communication, social media, etc., it's a real problem. It's going to become a bigger and bigger problem into the future, I think, for global health.
Let's ask Phil then about that. The anti-science agenda working in your company. How have you tackled that?
Yeah, it's certainly very difficult, needs to be focused on a lot of data. I did want to come back to the nationalism though. So as an engineer, I also think about those are somewhat given facts, and can we engineer around those? So I would actually go back to the Salk polio vaccine. When Jonas Salk launched it, it was made at a bunch of public health labs in the US. It was distributed manufacturing. States made their own vaccine. It was then distributed. And as we think about a pandemic response, the technology exists to distribute manufacturing much more rapidly than we could in the past. And so, thinking about nationalism, let's actually have a solution that may not prevent all of the challenges of nationalism, but actually enable us to better respond, knowing nationalism is an issue that we are going to face.
Thank you. Well, let us now look at some of the questions coming in. Thank you so much for all these great questions. There's a great deal in there. Let's see which ones we haven't sort of tackled already. There's a question here from Vasco, which I think would be for you, Velina. It's in the Q&A. It's quite long, so I'm not going to read it all out, but Vasco Ricoco Pexoto is asking about the next never surpassed pandemic surveillance problem is very high levels of under ascertainment, under detection of infections. So have you had a look, if you've seen that question, I think, Velina, do you want to pick up on that then? Some of the variants being not picked up on early enough. Is it, how much of a problem is it? And how much is preparedness looking at those variants? Velina?
Oh, well, absolutely. Absolutely. We're looking at the variants. I mean, I'm speaking about the EU, but I'm sure that is also the case in the US and other parts of the world. We have been, in fact, as part of the so-called HERA incubator. So sorry for these sometimes fancy titles that we come up with, but the predecessors or the preparatory steps that we launched in the meantime, leading up to HERA, one of the things was that we wanted to support member states with enhanced capacities for what is called genomic sequencing. So that is the whole lab capacity to detect the variants. And why do we want to do that? Well, that is essential for building up the next sort of levels of vaccines that are would protect us against the mutations of the virus. And I know that the vaccine manufacturers, the ones that we have in the EU, but I'm sure others also globally, are already looking into next phase of the vaccines. So yes.
Thank you. I think Rainer would like to also respond to that. Thank you for that, Velina. Rainer, what's your take?
Yeah, I think surveillance is critical. We've got to keep one step ahead, so we're not just constantly playing catch up. But on the other hand, you know, there are also people working on, in terms of COVID anyway, there's people working on pan-coronavirus vaccines or universal coronavirus vaccines, which would solve that problem of variants of concern emerging. But I think we need to look at all kinds of surveillance, not just traditional public health surveillance, but things like the sewage surveillance has been really effective to give early signals before you know that there's, you know, transmission happening in a community, but also open source data, you know, maybe not so much for COVID, but for new and emerging infections. And I know that, you know, the ECDC has developed something called EpiTweeter and is using some of that sort of open source surveillance, because people talk about outbreaks and what's happening in their communities, and news agencies report on them long before a notification hits the desk of a public health official. But public health has been a bit slow to adopt digital technologies, but I think this pandemic has kind of accelerated that.
And perhaps let's bounce it over to Sui Keng then, this idea of using open source data, of monitoring social media, Big Brother, as we might once have called it, but it's happening already. Is that a useful tool then in international surveillance?
The evidence, I'm not too familiar with the evidence, Sue, so I will be a bit guarded in my answer. I think that social media, data analytics, big data, predictive analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence are all concepts that humanity, Homo sapiens, our species, we don't really fully comprehend yet. Secondly, governments and societies don't really fully comprehend the in my opinion, enormous and sometimes quite terrifying power of this, say, the digital side of our world. Thirdly and finally, I don't think our global health community truly has not only the evidence and data and frameworks, not only the evidence and data, but also we don't have the frameworks of how to deploy these new technologies. So that is my guarded answer to say that we, as with many tools or all tools, they are probably neutral. It's how we wield these tools that make the difference between whether or not we're actually preparing well for the next pandemic or we're actually creeping into authoritarianism. Because well, we all know that this pandemic has also been used as an excuse by many authoritarian governments to creep more towards authoritarianism, and we don't want health to be politicized or weaponized against democracy. Over to you, Sue.
Yes, thank you. And Phil, do you have a perspective on that from the private sector? If the surveillance is indicating what's coming up, does that help you think ahead to what you might want to work on?
Yeah, I think I would go back to the more reflective prioritization as critical rather than what's happening today. Because if it's happening today, the type of work we do in development is probably too late to do it de novo. It's going to be what we did the last 10, 20 years that'll help us respond. I did want to pick up though on surveillance, because I was very happy to hear Valina talking about antimicrobial resistance and HERA. In the US, BARDA has some small amount of money, but there are many of us that think that's a problem that really needs more funding in the US, and we haven't been able to garner it. But I understand a large part of that is surveillance and understanding the evolution of the resistance in bacteria and try and understand how we stay ahead of it. Is that going to be something you also consider, Valina, at HERA?
Thank you, Phil. Well, actually, one of the big things that we consider, not only for HERA, but in general, and this is probably, you may have actually more experience with this, is how to bring a new antibiotic to market. Yeah. And you spoke about these push and pull incentives, and there the whole paradigm, the whole economic model is non-existent, doesn't work, because this new antibiotic, as you know, Phil, probably the others as well, will have to be used very, very sparingly, because the whole point is that you use it sparingly, you ensure prudent use, and that obviously does not create any market incentive for the developers like yourselves. So this would be together with, it's not completely clear yet in terms of sort of the institutional setup, whether it will be HERA or whether it will be under the existing Horizon Europe program, which is our research and development program. But that is one of the things that we have put there in our pharmaceutical strategy, pull incentives for new antibiotics. We have had the push, but it is that last stretch, as you said, this valley of death, as we call it, the last stages of clinical trials. And very importantly, what happens once it's there? And this, I think you also mentioned, once it's developed, does it have a market? Who buys it? The commitment from the countries to buy it, the EU countries, but then of course globally, and how do we ensure the stewardship? So that is definitely something big that we will be working on over the next years.
Thank you. And back to Phil there, because you talked about the valley of death, as it's known, about that stage. Phil, what is the most difficult and challenging stage when you are developing something?
So I think one of the critical areas in especially the diseases that we're talking about, oftentimes there's not enough incidence of the disease to do clinical trials before an outbreak. So in the case of smallpox, we had to show efficacy in animal models and then bridge to humans and show that it would do that. When I was working on Ebola in the early 2000s, fortunately, it was also predominantly theoretical. So it was very difficult to show efficacy for something that hasn't had an outbreak yet. Obviously, when there's an outbreak, you do follow-up clinical trials to prove that it worked, but that turns out to be a very difficult part. And then the other part is that scale up, because you do want to go, as an engineer, I work in manufacturing, I've done vaccine development for a long time. You want to go from having a little bit of it to billions and billions of doses. And we are very fortunate that adenovirus, the J&J AstraZeneca technologies, and mRNA were amenable to scaling up rather rapidly. And so identifying technologies, developing them, and being able to deploy them in a rapid basis are very difficult.
Yes, and that's really important then, that point you make about those technologies. A question now from somebody who sent this in, which thank you to Lynn Saveka of EUHA, asking, how could we make governments less afraid of coordination and shared surveillance and preparedness? Valina, is that one for you? How do you be less afraid?
Well, that's I think a very good question. Again, I'm going to speak maybe understandably a bit more about the EU experience. The thing in the EU is that the member states retain their prerogative for action. They're responsible for the very important thing, funding of the healthcare system. So naturally, they don't, that's a lot of money in any country's national budget. That's a big chunk of the national budget. So understandably, they don't want to, how can I say, surrender the powers to a supranational entity as is the European Union. On the other hand, coordination, as I said, has proven vital. So it is, we are trying to strike the right balance between as much coordination as we can possibly have for the benefit of everybody, while respecting that responsibility of the member states that exists for the funding and organization of the national system. And sometimes we also have countries that are federal states as well. So that gets even more complicated there with the regions and so on. So this would be my answer. I don't know how to make them less afraid, but hopefully we are striking the right balance now with the revision of our health security legislation.
Indeed, and to everybody, please do keep these questions coming in. It's great. You've got the opportunity to speak to these amazing experts from across the world. Velina, staying with you though for a moment, picking up on that about how this can be funded. You touched on Horizon Europe and the availability of funding there. What then about how could Horizon Europe be combined with other initiatives to help with those costly trial phases for the pharmaceutical industry? How could that be put together?
Well, HERA in itself will already put it together because the funding for HERA, which is about 6 billion over the next years, will come from several sources. One of them is the EU for Health, as I mentioned, that is the health program. So we do have a health program. So the EU is also spending money on health, but it cannot fund hospitals, let's say. We are funding operational actions that aim to show and to boost, complement what member states are already doing. So that's one bit. And then the second big one is Horizon Europe. And HERA, if I can just elaborate a little bit on this, because there was also a question I spotted about, I think I replied to one about the differences between HERA and ACDC, and there was another one, never mind, about the threats assessment. How will that what would be the role of HERA when it comes to threats assessment vis-a-vis the role of ECDC, which also does, of course, the rapid risk assessment. I mean, the point of HERA is not to do the everyday sort of epidemic intelligence that the ECDC does. It is rather to do the vast horizon scanning, to look at, are we running short on some critical supplies? And Phil mentioned here the importance of stockpiling all sorts of medical countermeasures. I mean, I'll give you one recently, just a couple of years ago, we had the joint procurement on pandemic influenza vaccines. That's not much in the public eye. Another one we had in botulinum antitoxin, on diphtheria antitoxin, all sorts of medical countermeasures that member states need to have, and yes, they expire, yes, and you need to renew them. And so all sorts of these, that would be the role of HERA, that big threat assessment of the horizon, and that would be the difference with ECDC. I hope I responded also to that question.
There's a lot in there, thank you. And I think Swee Keng, you'd like to come in on this now.
I do, Sue, but on an earlier question that was asked by Lynn, a very interesting question about how do we make governments feel less threatened? May I make some comments about that one? Actually, 5 comments. The first one is to build on what Velina has mentioned, that a sense of control is very important. So if you want countries to receive more coordination, then you have to make them feel like they always retain control, not just the data privacy elements of the data that is being shared, but also that decisions are not taken out of their hands. It's the proverbial adage that everybody wants coordination, but nobody wants to be coordinated. Therefore, you have to approach that very carefully. Secondly, to convince them about the costs and benefits. Thirdly, maybe we can use a bit of a fear of missing out or peer pressure, whatever the term that we prefer, that when so many countries are already in a data sharing alliance, that many other countries or some other countries will want to join it because they don't want to miss out. So I think there could be some peer pressure there. Fourthly, is to use laws, regulations, maybe even disincentives and incentives. And finally, is to approach this very carefully and gradually. What I mean to say is the story of boiling the frog. So if you want to coordinate data, for example, then you start with a few areas of data that you coordinate, and you gradually build this up over time, while always respecting the sovereignty of the nation states that are actually sharing this data in the first place. It was very enjoyable to think through this question, and thank you to Sue and to Lynn. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you. Gosh, you've got a great deal in there again. It would be really interesting to hear a little bit about the climate impact that we sort of touched on at the top, to hear a bit more about what you feel the impact might be, whether climate is going to make a difference in terms of, I don't know, thawing out anthrax or something. Rainer, what are your concerns about how climate change might impact on the pandemics we could face in the future?
Look, climate change clearly will have an impact. If you look at infections like malaria, they're now occurring at higher and higher altitudes because of global warming, and with the other, with the pressures on farming and livestock practices, there'll be more and more encroachment on animal habitats, which will, increase the risk of spillover events. And I think, we haven't had, a lot of people talk about One Health, but it's still very siloed, I think people from the veterinarian and agricultural sector talk about One Health more than the human health people do. So somehow we need to bring all of that together with the climate change experts to try to look at, and identify the areas of greatest risk into the future.
So One Health, then, can you just elaborate? What do you mean by that in terms of bringing together human health, animal, planet? What's the concept?
Yeah, it's human and animal health, but related to the environment and climate and all of those things, ideally. Some people say planetary health, to encompass climate more specifically. But I think it's something we do need to address urgently to be able to mitigate the risk of future pandemics.
Thank you. Let's take a look at some of the questions that are coming in. Let's take Vasco again. Has strategic foresight, horizon scanning, scenario drawing are very important to inform decision makers, the public and the scientific community. Velina, what are your thoughts on that comment?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is what I meant earlier when I mentioned part of the work that HERA is intending to do, but also to build on what Rainer was just saying. Climate change, I mean, quantifying the impacts of climate change, that is absolutely difficult. And at the same time, we do need this, and we need it in terms of policymakers need to know, so what should I expect in order to be able to adapt? So this is the other sort of side of climate change. One is reducing the emissions mitigation, but the other one is adapting to the impacts of climate change. And we need to know this ahead, because some of the adaptation efforts is going to be vast. And so that is absolutely important. And at the same time, there's the element of how do you assess the risk? How do you assess the uncertainty of the scientific findings there? So yes, absolutely, not very easy to capture, I would say.
Thank you.
I was going to pick up.
Yes, please come in.
Hey, Sue, I was going to pick up on what Velina was talking about. I think one of the challenges we saw in COVID was dealing with uncertainty and imperfect scientific data. At least in the US, our institutions were built really to get all the data and make recommendations, not have a quarter of the data or half the data, have to make a call and then move forward. So I think it's a really good comment on getting people comfortable with scenario planning, that every decision we take and every product we develop isn't going to be the right one, but that's okay, because we have to have multiple attempts to eventually get what it is that will mitigate a pandemic or be the correct product or be the pathogen that emerges. With global warming, we're, at least in the community that I've been part of thinking about product development, we wouldn't have thought of chikungunya and dengue as things that, we might worry about in the US someday. Now we do, because of global warming. So getting people comfortable with that uncertainty, talking about it broadly so they understand there is some certainty, but some things will do that may not have to go all the way through if things change.
And in terms of that, another of the words that came out fairly strongly in our word cloud there was about political will. In order to address this, to take on board the changes with the climate, where does political will sit in this to make a difference so that we can actually move forward here? Velina.
Well, political will is by all means important. I think somebody from you mentioned, maybe Raina, the ideas of culture and leadership. I really like this. But on the other side, if you allow me to say, on the other side of the equation is community engagement. And we see this with vaccines. We still have people that oppose vaccines. So whatever leadership we may have had and in the scientific field to invent the vaccines, and then in the political field to buy them, to provide them, to organize, vaccination centers and what have you. If you have on the other side, I mean, look at within the EU, we have countries like Bulgaria with barely like 20% of the people vaccinated, and then others that are already above 90, like Denmark, and abandoning all COVID-19 measures. So you do need that other element, and I think also in the word cloud, or somebody else also already mentioned health literacy. Absolutely, absolutely. We should not be under any illusion that besides having been, appended by a pandemic, we have also been facing an infodemic. It is massive, and disinformation and misinformation that is out there is enormous. So I think these are going to be other challenges that are not specifically health, not the disease in itself, but they're going to have big impacts on how we manage to deal with future pandemics.
Thank you. And Sui Keng, over to you.
I agree with all my fellow panelists, and I think they make great points. Let me propose one more that I think perhaps has not been discussed so far, and that probably is crucial to pandemic preparedness as well, and that is universal health coverage and healthy populations. A lot of the conversation today has been about science, which is important, and science is beautiful. I'm a scientist, I love science, science works, and we will win with science. But to translate that science into actual shots in arms requires not only vaccines, but vaccination programs. And vaccination programs require public administration, public policies, financing, and so on. And that is situated within a broader society that we need to make and encourage health-seeking behavior, good health literacy, and understanding and acceptance of science and expertise. And all that requires years of investment as well, and patient work, so that we don't funnel a lot more resources into the science aspect of things, but and then in so doing, forget about the importance of healthy populations, universal health coverage, and political action towards universal health coverage and healthy populations. I want to go back to something that Phil said earlier about imperfect incrementalism. Love that. So allow me to build on that by saying that every pandemic that human beings have, that Homo sapiens has encountered in the last century or so has taught us something. So we've added new facets to our, shall we say, arsenal of tools. So before SARS in 2003, the history of global health and pandemic preparedness was a lot about border control. Then the world globalized with a lot of international travel. SARS in 2003 taught us that border control alone is not enough. We need to prevent and detect that source. So we added a new facet. Ebola added a new facet, which is surge healthcare capacity. And a prolonged COVID is adding a fourth facet of our understanding of pandemics and preparedness and global health security, which is that of healthy populations. We need living wages, we need to ensure that there's good nutrition. People need to be encouraged to demonstrate health-seeking behavior. All that is healthy populations. So we have to fight pandemics with everything we have, not just science. And I think this is something that we could all bear in mind as well. Thank you, Sue. Over again to you.
Thank you. And you touched there, Sui Keng, on detection. A question coming in about that. The WHO has a pandemic intelligence hub that's just been launched in Berlin. So in terms of detection, how's that going to work? Can that work along with HERA, Velina?
Thank you. I don't actually know the exact answer to this, but I do imagine that, as I said earlier, HERA would work with all international partners that have similar sort of missions to HERA. I don't know, I admit, specifically about the WHO Pandemic Intelligence Hub. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'd like to go back also to the idea we touched on earlier about an international pandemic treaty, which is under consideration. A question has come in from Marcus Frischhut. asking, is the European Health Union approach in itself enough, or do we need a treaty to change from a legal perspective? So how does this tie in across Europe? Is an international pandemic treaty going to work? Phil, I'd like you to touch on it, because I understand the US is not very supportive of this international pandemic treaty.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of background on the international treaty and the U.S. perspective broadly, but I will say what is important, I think, in communication is this idea of practicing, of making sure that we do have these channels open. I think the hope that I had during COVID was there was these amazing informal networks of scientists. As an engineer that designed vaccines for most of my career, there were informal calls and helping people figure out where to get glass for vials and how to scale up. But there was an amazing amount of informal collaboration that happened really around the globe as everyone in this field kind of stepped in. I think treaties and I think areas of sharing are critical. Personally, I would hope the US would ultimately be supportive. But I do think those are critical to institutionalize the opportunity to communicate. Doesn't mean everybody will. I'm sure there'll be political challenges around it. But if we don't at least have the framework or the mechanisms, we can't practice it for when we really will desperately need it in the next pandemic.
Indeed. And Rainer, what do you make of that? Do you think the idea of an international pandemic treaty could work?
It could work, yes, theoretically, of course, but the question is the political will and the how difficult it'll be to get unity across different countries. And in the end, I suspect nationalism will stand in the way of such a treaty. You know, we've got many global treaties, you know, we've got and agreements and conventions, but many of them are not enforceable. They're not, you can't audit them. Biological Weapons Convention, for one, you know, you can't audit it. So I think it's a good thing to do, but I'm not sure how effective it would be.
Thank you. And Sweetling, going back to your point earlier about you don't want to invent new institutions, you want to strengthen what's there. Would you welcome an international pandemic treaty?
I would, if it strengthens existing institutions, one. Number two, there are clear enforcement provisions and not just a treaty for treaty's sake. Any international pandemic treaty will probably be only the second treaty under the World Health auspices of the World Health Organization. The first one is the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So any pandemic treaty will only be the second WHO treaty. This indicates that the WHO doesn't have enough institutional experience and maybe even capacity to enforce this treaty. And even the FCTC is continually being eroded by the tobacco companies, big tobacco, and so on and so forth. So we can write a treaty, of course, but the enforceability will always be a challenge. And we may need a treaty that lies outside the auspices of the World Health Organization. And this is really in the realm of geopolitics and international relations, not really my field. I think the United Nations Security Council will really need to get involved. The last time I checked, in the year 2020, the first year of the pandemic, there were about 20-something United Nations Security Council resolutions, and only one was about COVID. So this indicates to us that the Security Council really needs to play a bigger role, and maybe they need to play a bigger role in the treaty itself. Thank you, Sue. Over to you.
Thank you. And thanks again to the audience for your comments and your questions that are coming in. To pick up a point here from Lynn of EUHA, she says, irrespective of the legal power question, I see a huge potential and interest from the healthcare sector, from the field, in my case of university hospitals, to work together, sharing information, the European health data space, common standards harmonized towards best practices. Does that resonate with you, Velina?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's obviously we look at it from sort of the top-down perspective, how we can make this happen. And this was one of the things that I mentioned earlier, potentially, I don't know specifically on Lynn's organization, but the idea that we want to have integrated surveillance, and that should bring together data flows from hospitals, from labs and so on, that are not always so integrated at the moment, to hopefully improve and have it what we call real-time surveillance, not that we know. For example, let's take AMR. At the moment, we know about the resistant pathogens with 1 year delay. That is, the annual surveillance reports are published. And so hopefully if we can make that less time, that will be important.
Thank you. Questions come in from Anonymous. Anonymous comes up with a lot of questions I find at these events, saying how, I think this is going to be bounced back to you, Velina, how willing are the member states in the EU to share their findings, and perhaps then let's take it globally, because some of these diseases won't necessarily originate. We don't know where they come from. They may be released deliberately, bioterrorism. Are there such capability gaps defined in the US? Is there an intent to strengthen coordination on this threat assessment between the US and the EU? Velina, what do you think?
To be frank, I don't fully understand the question, because we do have, as I say, epidemiological intelligence, which is carried out by the ECDC. So they sit in Stockholm and monitor potential diseases, outbreaks all over the globe. And so in terms of how fast we picked up the signal that there's some problem in Wuhan, China, I'll tell you, it was on 9th of January that we, the Commission, posted back to member states in the early warning and response system that we have in the EU, a pneumonia of unknown etiology in Wuhan, China. And that was, I would say, several days after it was discovered, so to speak. So I don't think that there is necessarily lack of willingness. I think if there's a threat, as I said, they're also, we're in the same boat, essentially. The member states are going to be facing it, and globally as well. So I don't fully think that there's any incentive for not sharing, at least within the EU.
Thank you. Phil, you'd like to come in there just briefly, if you would.
Yeah, just briefly. So I think the question may also be around things like botulism and smallpox. So the US does threat assessments. They're classified, they're not shared. And then they determine in a public RFP, a request for proposal, how much product to buy. And I think it is challenging for some other countries because they don't understand what those scenarios are. So models like RENA's that help people understand how much of a vaccine should we have for a particular disease would be helpful if there was more global coordination there and discussion in the open about that data.
Thank you. Well, there's so much packed in there. You've been amazing. We are drawing to a close. So I'd like to ask each of you to have a concluding thought, perhaps a takeaway tweet that sums up really your thinking on this, looking ahead. Rainer, could I come to you first?
Yes, thanks, Sue. My biggest concern is synthetic biology and genetic engineering, gain of function research. I think the biological technology has come ahead moved ahead in leaps and bounds, far beyond the way we think about regulation and risk management. It's very analogous to cybersecurity, but we're probably 10 years behind in biosecurity. And I think in my view, the next pandemic will be unnatural in origin, whether it be through a lab leak or deliberate. It's just the probability is just so much higher because of the ease of access of the methods, the technology, and the cost.
Thank you. Swee Keng, your closing thought.
So my closing thought is that health is a political choice. Even with all the science in the world and all the advances that we have in surveillance, vaccines that can be developed and rapidly scaled up in a space of 2 to 3 months or something like that, health remains a political choice, and political leaders and countries that choose to invest in health will not only enjoy the legitimacy from their citizens in the form of elections, but also the form of, enjoy the benefits of good health outcomes. So that's my final thought. Health is a political choice. Thank you, Sue. Over to you.
Thank you. And Phil, your closing thought?
Sure, I'd like to build on Swee Keng's thought, because I think we do have a toolbox that's shown to be very effective, quite frankly. With the COVID outbreak, what we need to do is distribute that globally and make sure the next time we have a response that includes a much broader distribution and equitable use of the vaccines, therapies that are out there. But we have the technology, we need the political will, and we need the funding.
Thank you. Velina, your brief thought.
Thank you. It's very hard to summarize because indeed you said this is a wealth of topics that we've discussed today. But if I could say one thing is that COVID-19 has obviously brought a lot of challenges to us, but it has also elevated health very high on the political agenda. And I think we must seize that momentum.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Seize that momentum. That's a great thought to end on. Thank you all so much to our 4 speakers for those contributions. Thank you to everybody who's put questions or comments online. And don't forget that you don't have to end the conversations here. You can head to those networking lounges that are on the EHFG conference platform. You can continue discussions there. You can meet and network. Who knows, maybe there's a virtual G&T in there as well. My name again is Sue Saville. It's been my great pleasure to guide these discussions. Thank you all very much indeed, and do enjoy the rest of the EHFG conference. Thank you and goodbye.